I'll formally introduce myself. I'm the director of the Office of Violence Prevention, which is located in the City of Milwaukee Health Department. Okay, cool. And the Office of Violence Prevention has actually been around since 2008. It's when the city decided to take a public health approach to violence prevention. Myself, I've been there for 2 years. We have aggressively expanded the size of the office. We've tripled the staff. We've also significantly increased the budget, primarily through federal support through the National Recast Initiative, which is, oh, you can't? Okay, sorry. So I talked about, in terms of the Office of Violence Prevention being expanded, both by staff and funding, particularly through a recast, which is a $5 million 5-year grant focused on trauma and healing, particularly with young people. It is a grant that 11 cities were selected for, and when I took the office here, several folks had emailed me different opportunities. This particular one was unique in the fact that it focused on communities that had had civil unrest as a result of systemic trauma. And so that was even before Sherman Park. So in terms of the presentation and the blueprint, I'll start with a brief overview of the Office of Violence Prevention and then dive into the blueprint for peace. All right, so the mission of the office is to prevent and reduce violence through partnerships that strengthen youth, families, and neighborhoods. We staff the Commission on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. We also fund the Safe Visitation Exchange Center in partnership with Children's Hospital, Sojourner Family Peace Center, and Legal Action. Recast Milwaukee, which again is focused on youth and families and healing, particularly after interpersonal violence, but also after systemic trauma. The Trauma Response Partnership, I'll talk about briefly in a moment on the next slide. Ceasefire Milwaukee is an effort, if you've ever seen the documentary, The Interrupters. It's really about engaging folks from the community who have had struggles with violence in their past to be able and have the credibility as health workers to interrupt the cycle of retaliatory violence, which we know drives a lot of the homicides and shootings in our city. Denim Day, which is an annual day that honors survivors of sexual assault, it really calls attention to the fact that we should never blame survivors of sexual assault and that they should be believed, and that we have to break the cycle that perpetuates that trauma as well, and then the blueprint for peace. So Recast Milwaukee, we have 20 funded grant partners, over $800,000 in funding to community-based partners over the past 2 years. We also funded approximately 11 organizations this summer, focusing on young people in the 10 priority neighborhoods of the Blueprint for Peace, who are serving young people ages 12 to 24. And with our partnership with community advocates and others, we've served, or over 500 practitioners have been reached with trainings in youth mental health first aid and trauma-informed care. The Trauma Response Initiative was launched in 2015, and over the past 2 years, we've expanded it from District 5 to now, from District 7 to also District 5. We've also trained the entire fire department and EMTs in trauma-informed care. And the way the model works is if a first responder responds to a scene where a child has witnessed or experienced violence, ages 6 and up, through our partnership with the Behavioral Health Division, that family is contacted within 48 hours and offered support to that young person who've experienced that. So through city funding, we actually fund 2 clinicians within the Child Mobile Crisis Response Team specifically on this project. And we're also working to evolve the program to a community-wide model so that it's not just an emergency first responder model, because we understand that community organizers, youth workers, teachers are oftentimes the first responder to a crisis or a young person who's seen or experienced trauma. So we want to have as many doors as possible that a family or a young person can access supports and services. So with the trauma response, and the number got cut off, we're at 632 since 2015 in terms of the number of referrals that have been made. As you can see from the graph, the majority of the referrals have been made for incidents where a young person has witnessed domestic violence. We also are seeing an increase in terms of young people who have witnessed shootings. More recently, you may have seen on the news that we've engaged hundreds of community residents in responding to the immediate spike in violence over the month of August. We're currently at about 19 homicides. The most violent was in 2016, where there were 23. What's little known is that the October of 2016, there were 22. It was the second most violent month of that year. So violence prevention is a year-round issue. And so we understand that the summer months are critical, but it's also something that we can't stop paying attention to. So now diving into the blueprint, and excuse me if I'm talking fast, I'm trying to respect time and agenda. So the blueprint was launched in the fall of 2016, and it was a very aggressive process. Most cities that we've looked at who engage in these types of processes take about 2 years. In some cases, they may take 3 months. But the way those blueprints or plans are produced are 5 people sitting in a room, which usually is the mayor, the police chief, a couple of ministers, and a young person, and they come up with a plan and they release it to the community. We were not committed to doing that. And thankfully, the mayor was also committed to ensuring that this blueprint was community driven. And I see several, including Julia Taylor and others, who are part of the steering committee of the blueprint. And really the role of the steering committee was to ensure that the voices of community members were centered in this process. So as I talk about the blueprint, one of the highlights I'm going to make are the actual quotes from young people and residents who are engaged in a variety of processes as a part of the development of the blueprint. The vision is that Milwaukee is a safe and resilient city where the lives of all residents are valued, promoted, and protected. Every word in this vision is intentional, and we grappled with the vision for the blueprint. We were also very clear that this would not be a youth violence prevention blueprint. We understand clearly that prevention and young people go hand in hand, but at the same time, when the average shooter in the city is 29, we refuse to put the plight of violence on the backs of young people. It is very convenient to blame young people for everything in this city, but as adults, we need to take responsibility for our peers and ensure that we can break this cycle of trauma at the childhood level, but also making sure that the adults in our community get the support that they need. There are 6 blueprint. I don't get applause a lot. There are 6 goals and 30 strategies in the blueprint. I won't read them verbatim. Again, if you have the handout, it's summarized there. And I'll also make sure this presentation is available to be emailed to everyone as well. Violence. I want to read this verbatim because it's critically important as well. We define violence as the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community, which either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. And although we're an amazing team, we did not come up with that. This is a definition from the World Health Organization. And the reason that this is also important is suicide actually was a topic that we had overlooked. And not necessarily intentionally, but it definitely, when we, this is probably the 3rd iteration of the blueprint, looked really deeply in terms of self-harm and understanding the impact of self-harm in our community, but also looking at the structural systemic factors which also produce violence. So when we talk about violence and trauma, both at a structural and a systemic level, these are examples that I wanted to highlight. When we think about Dontre Hamilton and what happened in Red Arrow Park, and we think about the fact that as a city, we've had a series of these issues, including the Sterling Brown case, which we're grappling with right now. Those things have an impact not only on the individuals involved, but on entire communities. And as a black man who was born and raised in Milwaukee, that has an impact on me. And so when we talk about trauma, we can't just talk about in terms of the individual, in terms of someone harmed me. We also have to look at what is the cumulative impact of injustice or the cumulative impact of being harmed or neglected by a system on a particular community. When we look at urban divestment and companies that have shut down and moved out of the central city, I know the mayor's been fighting for Amazon to try to, and other groups, the GMC and others have been trying to get companies to locate in the central city where the jobs are needed. When we look at young people who have experienced trauma in their homes and have inflicted and transferred that pain to others in our community and end up in an institution where they are further harmed, abused, and neglected, that is systemic trauma. When we think about Zelaya Jenkins, my 4th month on the job, I got a call at about 10 o'clock at night, and I went down to the area where the house that she was in was shot up and engaged her community members on the corner, ended up building a connection with the family and attending the funeral with the mayor and others in the city. And unfortunately, my team has attended at least 4 children's funerals in the city. And particularly with Justin Evans last year, who was preparing to go fishing, my children were actually down south with my father and they were going fishing. And I don't cry often, although we should. But I was on the phone with my daughter, and she's never seen me cry before. And she was telling me what she was doing, and she had no idea, what was going on here. And so, I had to explain it to my children, and she was 10 at the same time that this young man was killed, and Zelaya Jenkins is 10. Justin Evans is actually 6. And so every child in this city should be able to go fishing. Every child in this city should be able to go to a quality school. Every child in this city should be able to walk the block without being afraid of being robbed, or being shot, or being killed. And then lastly, poverty. And I put a quote here that poverty is the worst form of violence, which is a quote by Gandhi, and also one of my literary heroes, James Baldwin, also stated that later. And one of the things that we've highlighted in the blueprint and unapologetically called out is the fact that there's nothing more violent than policy and poverty. And so to elected officials in the room and people who actually influence policy, it is very important to understand how those policies have an impact on the lives of individuals and families in this community. So for those wonks in the room who studied this stuff for a while, there's a socio-ecological model that the CDC has developed, and it basically breaks down looking at violence, and you can use this for a range of issues at different levels. So individual, relationship, community, and societal. And this is one of the foundational frameworks for the blueprint. So the strategies in the blueprint and the goals are reflective across these different layers. One of the other key pieces I wanted to point out, which are highlighted in the blueprint and the summary, is the Prevention Institute, with support from the Medical College Healthcare Wisconsin Endowment. We were able to receive support from them to help develop the Blueprint for Peace. And one of the frameworks that the Prevention Institute has developed is something called the ACER framework. So we know a lot about ACEs in terms of adverse childhood experiences. What this framework looks at as adverse community experiences. And so really looking at the fact that the production of trauma is not just individual, but it's also communal. And that impact has an impact on the community. So the blueprint is also arranged to address 3 factors that this model calls for: opportunity, people, and place. So understanding that the built environment has an impact. So if you live in a neighborhood where there's a lack of investment, there's dilapidated housing, place structures, etc., that has an impact on the psyche and mentality of the whole community. If people don't trust each other or feel cohesive, it's really hard to take ownership of your neighborhood. And we obviously know with the level of forced displacement and also eviction that has an impact on being able to build a cohesive community. And then looking at place. And so the built environment, having pride in the city. Oh, I'm sorry, I mentioned place already. Equitable opportunity. So that's looking at jobs, employment, quality education, etc. So these are a few, that actual document is broken down in diverse community experiences and resilience on the far right-hand corner, and then the technical package. The CDC has produced very detailed documents on domestic violence, sexual assault, youth violence prevention. All of these things have informed the blueprint. So the strategies in there are community driven, but evidence informed. So and keep in mind, there's a lot on the cutting floor. So all of the ideas that the community came up with and prioritized that we should be doing to reduce violence, we also looked at other communities and research to also find the evidence that that strategy can be supported by. There were a series of risk and resilience factors that were called out. I'm going to read the quote at the top right-hand corner. Poverty is traumatic, segregation is traumatic, experiencing life as a have-not among haves is traumatic. That is from a resident of the city of Milwaukee who participated in this process. These risk and resilience factors were prioritized at the very first meeting. We had about 150 community members at Discovery World. And again, they were able to narrow this down to say, what are the driving factors that produce the greatest risk for violence in the city? And then there was also a list of resilience factors. In some cases, they were the extreme, the exact opposite of the risk factor, but in some cases, they were different. So when we look at collective efficacy as a resilience factor, when we look at local investment, strong neighborhood centers, things like that were called out. For the blueprint, you can look at the risk and resilience factors and you can actually track which goals address those factors. So this particular page of the blueprint will allow you to do that. There are 10 priority neighborhoods that were identified, looking at compiled simple assaults, aggravated assaults, non-fatal shootings, and homicides over a 3-year period. As we know, we saw a significant spike in 2015. We weren't alone in that spike around the country. And so after that, we've had a 2-year decline in homicides. We were doing well this year until the 1st of August. And so now we're on par with last year, but we're still not back at 2015. But that's still not something to celebrate. And so we have to, as a community, continue to work at that. And so for the ceasefire effort, we're going to be launching that in the Old North Milwaukee neighborhood, and our plan is to launch that by next month. So I want to just give a really quick 2 examples of the blueprint in action, because sometimes people, it's a great document, but it's like, what does it look like in practice? So speaking of fostering safe and strong neighborhoods, this past weekend, there was an effort called Stand for Peace. And basically it was an effort at Teague and Taylor Park to, one, paint the basketball court, engage residents in having a vision for the park, and there were also peace posts installed. So when you look at goal number 5, which is foster safe and strong neighborhoods, objective number 1, create safe and accessible community spaces, and you look at strategy E, increase investments to parks and playground infrastructure, equipment, and landscaping to prioritize neighborhoods to ensure playgrounds are safe and accessible for all. That is exactly what they did. So if you saw that news story on the news about that effort, where hundreds of people came out on this weekend for that effort, that's an example. The role of the Office of Violence Prevention, it's only 7 of us, and although we're amazing, we cannot implement the blueprint. We have to implement the blueprint. And the mayor is very clear, this is not a political document for him to hold and say, look at how great I am. He is very clear that this is a community plan, this is a community blueprint, and it has to outlive any political term. And so we've had some tension with the Common Council over that, but at the end of the day, we all have to own this blueprint. And if we don't, we have to answer to our community, because the community came up with these strategies. And if we talk about interrupting the production of trauma, it will be the greatest crime to ask the community what we should be doing to heal and respond to violence and not invest the policies and resources necessary to implement it. So the other example, in terms of promoting healing and restorative justice, I think I highlighted that through the Trauma Response Partnership, and there are many others, and much of the work that's being done in this room is reflective, but I assume that most folks in this room would care a lot about this particular goal as it relates to trauma. And one of the things that a young person said as a part of the process is we need places to address trauma and respond to community anger. And that place, to what Jeanette Walker mentioned, should be the entire state. It should be the entire city. I shouldn't only have one after-school program to go to in the city or one trusted adult to go to. We should be a city that is healing informed, that is really focused on how to create access for young people to get the support that they need. All right, for the sake of time, I'll close here. These are just photos of examples of some of the work that's happening in the city at a grassroots level to engage young people, to support healing in schools. That's happening every day. So anybody who says that we're not doing enough as a city, that we don't care enough, you need to check them and ask them, have they read the blueprint? Are they going to support the blueprint? And to actually put the resources where their mouths are. Thank you.